So picture this. You walk into your local grocery store, and you suddenly realize that the exact same food you bought just a few months ago now costs way, way more. Your paycheck? Well, that hasn't changed at all. But every single day, the money in your pocket is literally buying less. It's a pretty terrifying feeling. Right? Well, during the 1970s, millions of people around the world didn't just have to imagine this. They actually lived it. Historians call this era the Great Inflation, and it's widely considered to be one of the most significant economic crises of the entire 20th century. But how did it actually begin? And why did it completely change the course of history?
Okay, let's get into this explainer. When we ask, why does your money buy less? What we're really talking about is inflation. Now today, we're pretty used to seeing prices bump up and down a little bit. But to truly understand just how vulnerable our money is, we have to look back. We have to look at a time when the whole global monetary system essentially fractured, when energy shortages caused absolute mayhem, and when everyday currency lost its value at a totally unprecedented rate.
We are talking about the period from 1965 all the way to 1982. You see, this wasn't just some brief, temporary spike in prices. This was a grueling, nearly 2-decade-long ordeal that completely turned economic policy on its head, drove massive political shifts, and fundamentally altered the daily lives of millions. It basically challenged everything governments thought they knew about how money actually worked. But to really grasp how things got so bad, we need to rewind just a little bit further.
Chapter 1. Before the Crisis.
The thing is, the Great Inflation didn't just fall out of the sky. It actually came right on the heels of an era of incredible prosperity, which ironically laid the hidden groundwork for the disaster. After World War II, a lot of countries experienced decades of really strong, steady economic growth. Factories were booming, international trade was expanding, and millions of families were enjoying a much higher standard of living. This was the famous post-war economic boom. But as we move into the late 1960s, some serious warning signs started flashing. Governments began ramping up their spending in a big way. We had major international conflicts, like the Vietnam War, combined with massive new social welfare programs. All this heavy deficit spending put intense pressure on national budgets. Now, at first, this seemed totally manageable, but under the surface, they were essentially pumping way too much excess money straight into the economy.
And this is where we see why policymakers weren't hitting the panic button yet. They were operating on a flawed economic rulebook. It all centered around this concept called the Phillips curve. Basically, the Phillips curve suggested there was a stable trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So governments falsely believed they could artificially keep unemployment perpetually low just by accepting a mild, controlled amount of inflation. They genuinely thought they had the economy completely figured out. They figured they could just buy lower unemployment with a little bit of inflation. But as history would brutally prove, this was an absolute false bargain.
Chapter 2.
The Turning Point. By the early 1970s, the global financial system was under immense stress, and those cracks in the foundation finally gave way. First off, in 1971, the United States completely severed the dollar's last remaining link to gold, which effectively killed the post-war Bretton Woods monetary system. Suddenly, global currencies were just floating without an anchor. Then, the crisis truly exploded in 1973. During the Arab-Israeli War, major oil-producing countries placed an embargo on oil exports. And because the global economy was incredibly dependent on imported oil, energy prices just soared, practically overnight. This dramatic spike was the very real consequence of that 1973 oil shock slamming headfirst into an already vulnerable economy.
So it's absolutely crucial to understand how a massive macroeconomic shock like this actually hits your wallet. It's basically a domino effect. Step 1, oil exports are reduced, creating a massive supply shock. Step 2, naturally, fuel prices surge. Step 3, since literally everything relies on energy, the costs for transportation and factory production instantly go up. And finally, Step 4, businesses can't just absorb all those extra costs, so they pass them straight on to you. Consumers suddenly find themselves paying significantly more for food, clothing, housing, all the everyday necessities. You're spending way more money, but your wages, they aren't budging.
Chapter 3. Life during stagflation.
We really need to bring this massive global crisis back down to the human level, because ordinary families were struggling just to survive. To understand what they were going through, we have to talk about a dreaded economic term, stagflation. This is basically the nightmare combination of high inflation, stagnant economic growth, and elevated unemployment. And this concept absolutely broke all the traditional economic models.
Remember that Phillips curve we talked about? It said inflation and unemployment were supposed to move in opposite directions, but during stagflation, prices just kept climbing rapidly even as the economy ground to a complete halt and people lost their jobs. It was the worst-case scenario. Grocery bills soared, simply heating your home became a luxury, and people sat in seemingly endless lines at gas stations just hoping to get a few gallons of fuel.
And the crazy thing is, the initial government responses were largely totally ineffective. Take President Gerald Ford's Whip Inflation Now, or WIN campaign. It encouraged voluntary thrift and savings from everyday Americans to combat rising prices. Before that, President Nixon had even tried mandatory wage and price controls, which frankly only led to worse shortages at the stores. These policies failed to cure the underlying economic illness because they were just treating the symptoms, the rising prices, rather than the actual root cause, which was an oversupply of money in the system.
Chapter 4. The Policy Response.
By the end of the 1970s, public confidence had deeply deteriorated. This forced governments and central banks to finally wake up and realize that much stronger, and frankly much more painful, action was absolutely necessary if they were going to survive this. We can clearly see this dramatic shift in approach. For years, the old strategy was the stop-go policies. The Federal Reserve would alternate between fighting unemployment and fighting inflation, loosening the money supply to boost jobs, and then tightening it when inflation got too hot. It created the zigzag effect that just made inflation so much worse over time. But then we get the new strategy, introduced by Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker in 1979. Volcker completely changed the game. He shifted the focus to strictly tightening the money supply and sharply raising interest rates. His goal was simple: wring inflation out of the system no matter the short-term cost.
And they really had to act fast because by 1980, right before Volcker's policies could fully take effect, inflation had neared a staggering 14.5%. Just think about that. Your money was losing nearly 15% of its purchasing power in a single year. It was completely unsustainable.
But the cure was incredibly bitter medicine. To stop inflation in its tracks, Volcker's extremely high interest rates intentionally triggered severe short-term economic pain. Borrowing became incredibly expensive. Businesses pulled back hard, and as a result, the economy fell into deep recessions in 1980 and again from 1981 to 1982. Unemployment peaked at nearly 11%, meaning millions of people lost their jobs. It was a highly controversial, truly agonizing adjustment. But it worked. By the end of 1982, the back of inflation had been broken, dropping back down to under 5% and setting the stage for decades of price stability.
Chapter 5. Lessons for today.
The Great Inflation fundamentally reshaped modern economic policy. It taught central banks that a strict, unwavering commitment to price stability is essential, and it actually birthed the practice of long-term inflation targeting that we see utilized all around the world today. As economist Jesper Rangvid so brilliantly put it, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Whenever modern inflation spikes start appearing in the headlines today, whether that's due to supply chain shocks or geopolitical conflicts, historians and economists immediately look straight back to the 1970s. The Great Inflation serves as this stark, glaring warning of what happens when central banks underestimate inflation and a grim reminder of the sheer human cost required to bring it back under control once it escapes. Which leaves us with one final critical question to think about. Are we prepared for the next great economic shock? You see, history isn't just about memorizing the past. It helps us understand our present and brace for our future. So, have our current governments truly learned the hard lessons of the Great Inflation? Or could we one day find ourselves right back in that grocery store watching our hard-earned money evaporate?